Good morning, church. Bob Myers here. Blessed to be with you today as we share our Bible study together. We finished up 2 Corinthians, and we decided we're going to go on through the New Testament and go into the epistles. And the epistles are basically letters that Paul has written to churches that he has planted and started and ministered in, and he's following up with different letters to these different churches. And so they've become part of the New Testament canon and God's inspired word. And we'll start with Galatians. The way I remembered the sequence was to remember the acrostic General Electric Power Company, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. And today we're going to start with Galatians. Galatians basically is Paul's answer to the Jewish leaders who followed him once he left the church and went on his missionary journeys. A lot of times, Jewish leaders would come into a church and they would begin some false teaching. And one of the falsities that they promoted highly was, yes, Jesus is great, but you also need to keep the law. And part of that law, the outward symbol, was circumcision. And it was a big issue. We read about it in Acts 13 and 14. There was a big conference on it in Jerusalem. And it was a big issue. And Paul writes this letter to the churches of Galatia. Now, Galatians is not a single church, but a group of churches that are in the area of Galatia. And so Paul is writing to these churches. And he begins by explaining his authority, his apostleship. He said, I was called by God. I didn't give you man's version. I gave you God's version because God gave it to me personally. He appeared to me. I went out in the desert and spent 3 years with God, and I got this message firmly implanted in my heart and mind, so I understand it by the Spirit. And so that's what I gave you. And verse 6, he says, his dismay at the church, he said, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. He said, I am so prized, I'm dismayed that so quickly you've taken the grace and freedom you have in Christ and added something to it. And so he goes through the whole book of Galatians explaining that grace alone, through Christ alone, is sufficient for salvation. And you don't need circumcision, you don't need outward signs, you don't need all these other things. Church membership, Sunday school, all those things are blessings, but you don't have to have them because Jesus is sufficient. Be blessed today as you start in the epistle of Galatians and read chapter 1 of the book, Paul's letter to the churches of Galatia, explaining the sufficiency of Christ alone for salvation. Be blessed today.